Mr. President, thank you for the opportunity to appear tonight, and I share my praise for my colleague, the senator from Connecticut. We came to the Senate together, and his leadership on this issue is something I admire. But more than leadership on the issue, I admire his heart and his compassion, because he has suffered because his citizens have suffered. And if you suffer and you don't try to change things, you don't try to do things differently, then you're not fully alive. And so I just honor that in you, that you're willing to be vulnerable and in your suffering try to find help for others. I have a little scar tissue on this, Mr. President, and I'd love to just describe the Virginia experience and my own personal experience on this, and then ask a series of questions to my colleague from Connecticut. I was elected to office for the first time in May of 1994 to the Richmond City Council, and at the time I was elected, Richmond had the second highest homicide rate in the United States per capita. I was sworn in on July 1, 1994. In October of 1994, October 14th, I'll never forget that day, in my city council district, in a public housing community that is the largest between Washington and Atlanta, Gilpin Court, a 35-year-old guy walked into an apartment and gunned down a family of 6, from a 35-year-old woman to her younger sister to tiny little babies and children. And I got a call as a city council member, and I raced to the scene, and it was chaos, and that has begun a 22-year experience of being too intimate with this problem. That funeral of the family in the Arthur Ashe Center in Richmond, with 3,000 people in 6 little white coffins at the front of the room, is something that I will never, ever forget. A number of years later, I was governor of Virginia. I had just taken a trade mission to Japan and had landed, checked into the hotel, had fallen asleep, and someone knocked at my door. It was April 16, 2007. My security detail says, "You have to call home. Something horrible has happened in Virginia. It's still underway." And I called to find that a shooting was still then taking place at Virginia Tech University in Blacksburg that eventually killed 32 people, injured dozens of others. At that point, the worst shooting incident in the history of the United States, but no longer. That was the worst day of my life, and it will always be the worst day of my life. Comforting the families of the victims, talking to the first responders who went into a classroom where bodies littered the floor, and heard in the pockets of deceased students and professors cell phones ringing as parents who had seen it on the news were calling their kids, just knowing they're at Virginia Tech, to ask them if they would be all right, a call that would never be answered. This traumatized some of the most hardened first responders that I know. I knew priests and ministers in that community who had seen a lot and were traumatized in the days to follow. And to the senator from Connecticut, you have a reasonable proposal on the floor with respect to background record checks. The deranged young man who had committed that crime and then killed himself was not supposed to get a weapon. He was federally prohibited from getting a weapon because he'd have been adjudicated mentally ill and dangerous, but the weaknesses of the background check system, gaps in the background check system, had enabled him to purchase this weapon and commit this unspeakable carnage. We learned everything we could learn from that tragedy. We fixed what we could fix, but to my everlasting regret, I could fix part of the background record check system. But when I went to my legislature and said, let's have universal background checks so this won't happen again, even in the aftermath of the worst shooting tragedy in the history of the United States, I couldn't get my legislature to do the simple thing that the voters, that gun owners, that NRA members said they should do. And then a year ago, it was in August of 2015, in the same community, the Blacksburg Roanoke community in Virginia, a young woman I know who was the TV reporter at WDBJ television, Alison Parker, who covered Senator Warner and me. We know her parents. She was shooting a live piece in the morning about an anniversary of a local chamber of commerce, and a mentally ill former employee of the station came up live on television and videoing himself and killed Alison and Adam Ward, her cameraman, and ultimately took his own life later that day. We got scar tissue in my town. We got scar tissue in my Commonwealth. We've got scar tissue in this country. We've got scar tissue personally. And after every one of these instances, we resolve to be better. We resolve to do more. Why do we need to be passive? Why do we need to do nothing? We resolve to do better and do more. And yet here in this body, we can't. We were together here, my colleague from Connecticut. Now, I talked about the worst day of my life at Blacksburg, but the worst day in the Senate was standing here on the floor in April of 2013 and having a debate about this very piece of legislation about background record checks. And we were surrounded in the gallery by the victims and the families from Newtown. And they were watching us. There's a line in the letter to the Hebrews that talks about being surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses. And we were surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses. And with them were Virginia Tech families. And they were together, and they were watching us, and they were praying, I know, for us that we would do the right thing. And yet, even with the family members who had suffered from your state, Senator Murphy and Senator Blumenthal, even with those family members hoping we would do the right thing, we couldn't get there. And as surely as night follows day, there have been other tragedies, and now something I hoped would never happen, a shooting tragedy that eclipsed even this horrific tragedy in Blacksburg in 2007. And so the question that has to be asked is, what will it take and when will we act? And so if I could ask you a series of questions, because I'm not just grappling with this as a legislator, I'm grappling with this as a person, as a parent, as a friend, as somebody who's got the scar tissue that we all have. I have an organization in my state that's headquartered in my state, the National Rifle Association, that says we can't do anything because of the Second Amendment. And so let me ask you a couple of questions to my colleague. You would agree with me, would you not? The Second Amendment, it's in the Constitution, so of course it's important. It's important like the First Amendment is important. Wouldn't you agree with me on that?
It's in there for a reason, Senator Kaine.
It's in there for a reason, and it's been in there since 1787, and Virginians were drafters. So it's in there for a reason, and it's important, just like the First Amendment is important. Let me ask you about the First Amendment. The First Amendment says there is a right to free speech and a right to freedom of the press. Now, does that mean constitutionally that I can go out and slander and libel anyone and there is no consequence for that? Is that what the First Amendment means?
The First Amendment is as important as the Second Amendment, but it comes with conditions and responsibilities. One of them is that you can't slander your fellow citizens. You can't yell fire in a crowded theater. There are important limitations since the beginning of the Republic built around the First Amendment, which frankly is as sacred as any of the individual rights that are encompassed in the Bill of Rights.
There's another part of the First Amendment that says that you have a right to assemble. Now, my understanding, and you're a lawyer, so you tell me if I'm wrong about the right to assemble, is you've got a right to assemble, but a government can condition that. It can say you've got to get a permit or you can assemble here, not there. It can't discriminate among points of view, but the common constitutional provision is that there can be reasonable restrictions on the time, place, and manner of assembly under the First Amendment, and that's completely constitutional. Is that your understanding of the clause?
It's yet another qualified right within the Bill of Rights.
And I could do the same thing on the Third Amendment, and I could do the same thing on the Fourth Amendment. I could do the same thing on the Sixth Amendment and on the Seventh Amendment, the right to trial by jury in civil matters. And in each of these rights, which are important, just like the Second Amendment is important, in each of these rights, we commonly accept, actually, we demand, not just accept, that consistent with the constitutional rights, there be reasonable limits so that we can live together in peaceable harmony as citizens. And would you agree with me that there's nothing about those reasonable restrictions in the First or the Second or the Third or the Fourth or the Sixth or the Seventh Amendments that is at all inconsistent with the constitutional framework that we take an oath to uphold when we come into this body?
I haven't memorized portions of the Constitution as well as Senator King has, but he very eloquently stated for us the preamble of the Constitution, which commits us first and foremost to preserve domestic tranquility and to protect the common defense. So at the very beginning of the Constitution is this obligation to take the issue of public safety as a sacred duty upon inheriting the mantle of preserving and defending the Constitution. And so, as you have stated, all of those rights in the Bill of Rights come with conditions and responsibilities demanded by the American people. And when we talk about the Second Amendment, it is educated by that very important preamble, which commands all of us to do whatever is necessary to protect the safety of our citizens.
And am I not right that the Second Amendment even has the phrase in it, well-regulated? It even acknowledges the notion that this particular right is one where regulation is contemplated.
Whereas the First Amendment doesn't place the conditions in the text,
Yeah.
They are read into it. The Second Amendment has conditions in the literal text.
So the organization in Virginia that makes this argument about the Second Amendment, I think we can clearly demonstrate it's specious. The Second Amendment is critically important. Those of us, we all take an oath to uphold it, and we do uphold it, but there's nothing inconsistent with the Second Amendment in terms of the provisions you're talking about on the floor. Let me ask you this. Here's an argument they also make. I hear them make this all the time. What these guys want to do, who are advocating these propositions, is they want to take away all your guns. Now, you were in the House for a while before I got here. Has there ever been, to your recollection in your time here, a proposal that's been put in place in Congress to take away the guns of American citizens?
It is a wonderful subtext to all of the rhetoric that comes from the gun lobby and the NRA, that there is this secret agenda to essentially get the camel's nose under the tent through a expansion of background checks or a restriction on individuals who are on the terrorist watch list to buy guns, because the ultimate goal here is to eventually parachute into people's homes and take away all of your weapons, gun confiscation. Of course, that is a mythology that has been created by the gun lobby in order to sell more weapons, in order to make people scared of their government so that they have to arm themselves. There is no logic to it, and as you state in reference to your question, there has never been a proposal before the United States Congress to engage in any of the widespread confiscation efforts that have been imagined out of thin air by these advocacy organizations.
I thought that was the case. I'm a gun owner and I'm a supporter of the Second Amendment, and I've been unaware of this body or any state legislature putting in a proposal to take away folks' guns, as advocates would suggest. Let me ask you this one. Here was a position this organization used to advocate all the time. We don't want to have things that restrict law-abiding citizens. We just want to keep guns out of the hands of the bad guys. That was, for a very long time, the NRA's position. Don't restrict law-abiding citizens. Keep guns out of the hands of bad guys. As far as you know, is there any way to enforce the existing laws and keep the guns out of the hands of the bad guys pursuant to the federal laws that have been placed for a very long time that prohibit 9 categories of people from owning weapons? Is there any way to do that job and keep the guns out of the hands of the bad guys without a comprehensive background record check so that somebody who's selling can determine whether or not somebody who's buying is a bad guy?
When we passed the background checks law initially, Senator Kaine, it was pretty good at keeping guns out of the hands of bad guys, because at that time, the vast majority of gun sales occurred in bricks and mortar gun stores. But what has happened since that time, as you know, is that sales of guns have transferred from bricks and mortar stores to online sales, to sales in gun shows. And because the law has not caught up, there are quite literally thousands of criminals and convicts and felons that are now walking into gun stores, are now just typing in armslist.com online and buying guns with no background check because the law has not kept up. So if you are truly sincere about stopping the bad guys from getting the guns, then you have to, by definition, expand the number of sales that are subject to background checks to those that are happening in 40% of the sales, which occur now online and in gun shows. Never mind the fact that the baddest of the guys are probably the ones that have had known connections and communications with terrorist groups who are not on that list today of those that are prohibited from buying guns.
Can I ask you this, since we've started to talk about this question? Has anybody come up to you and said, hey, people on the terrorist watch list, we just shouldn't be worried about them? You know, why would we worry about people on the terrorist watch list? Have they tried to argue that those are good guys?
Quite the opposite. They would rise to the highest level of concern for most of our constituents.
So here's where I'm puzzled. So an organization that says they're about the Second Amendment, they advocate a position that has no support in the Second Amendment. An organization that says and shakes their fist, we're trying to take their guns away, that has no basis because there are no such provisions that are on the floor or that have been introduced. And an organization that says they want to keep guns out of the hands of bad guys, the only way to do that is to have a background record check. So doesn't it seem like the organization's principles are really, well, let's start with this. It seems to me that they're at odds with the point of view of not only most Americans, but also most gun owners. Most gun owners support the common sense provisions that you are describing here on the Senate floor.
I assume that you have gun clubs in Virginia just like we have them in Connecticut. And if you walk into a gun club in Connecticut, there's going to be pretty solid consensus that criminals shouldn't buy guns and that those law-abiding gun owners that sit in those gun clubs on Saturdays and Sundays have absolutely no problem with sales online or sales at gun shows being subject to background checks because they've gone through background checks. And they know that on average, a background check takes less than 10 minutes. They know that it is nothing more than a 9-minute on average inconvenience for someone that's buying a gun, and they support it further. Frankly, those guys in the gun clubs are amongst the loudest in their concern that terrorists have the ability today to buy dangerous weapons and commit mass murder like we saw in Orlando. And so this consensus that exists out there in the American public is not a consensus amongst progressive Democrats. It's a consensus amongst gun owners, non-gun owners, Democrats, Republicans, moms, dads, conservatives, liberals, Georgia, Connecticut, California. There isn't a cross-section of the American public that doesn't support keeping bad guys from getting guns, and thus the two reforms that we are asking for here today, a law that prohibits people on the terrorist watch list from getting guns, and a law that expands background checks to all of the forums in which guns are sold today.
And I would go one further. Not only is it consistent with what the American public wants in virtually any zip code in this country, I think the notion of keeping guns out of the hands of bad guys, which for a long time has been the stated principle of the National Rifle Association, I think that is in accord with the opinions of the members of the National Rifle Association. As I've seen polling about NRA members, the members of the organization overwhelmingly support background record checks because they want to keep guns out of the hands of bad guys.
And Senator Kaine, they support it. NRA members support it at the exact same rate that non-gun owners and non-NRA supporters, non-NRA members support it. And in fact, NRA members, frankly, have been historically those who have been most supportive of provisions that would prevent guns from getting into the hands of criminals, because NRA members, by and large, are law-abiding gun owners. And so they historically have had some of the greatest concern about this, which is why it's so hard to understand this disconnect between where their members are, where gun owners are, and where the advocacy organization is.
And that's talking about outside this building. How about the disconnect between what our citizens and gun owners and NRA members want and expect us to do, and the complete lack of action, and frankly, counterproductive action? I mean, let's talk about that. Congress has given gun manufacturers a unique form of liability protection that virtually nobody else gets in this country. We have put a number of restrictions in place to stop research into causes of gun violence, to stop the ability to trace weapons in gun violence. Don't all these are not only not doing the right thing, but doing the wrong thing in the sense of the thing that seems completely contrary to the wishes of the constituents who send us here to represent them.
And when you present these issues to the American public, they scratch their heads, right? They scratch their heads because they assume already that individuals on the terrorist watch list can't buy guns. And they think it's absurd that we passed a law that subjects toy guns to a greater standard of negligence than real guns. I mean, that's what that law effectively did. That law said that if you sell a toy gun, then you are going to be subject to a higher standard of negligence if that gun misperforms. Then a gun company is going to be held to if its gun, its real gun, misfires. And when you explain that to somebody in your state, whether you're in a red state or a blue state, they scratch their head. It doesn't make sense to them.
And finally, the Senator, if I could do this, I know as part of standing on this floor, you're not standing here over, words in draft legislation. You're standing here because of people. And I sat with you and we talked about people in your community who had been affected. I would love to tell you the story about just one Virginian, if I could, and then I would love to have you comment on the story that I'm going to tell you. And I could tell a lot of stories and a lot of different people that I could, but one just epitomizes to me so plainly this challenge, and it's a story of a man named Liviu Librescu. Liviu Librescu was one of the people killed at Virginia Tech. He was a professor of aerospace engineering. He was an amazing professor. And on April 16, 2007, when Sung-Wi Cho came into Norris Hall and started shooting people, he stood in front of the door and he told his engineering students to try to get out of the window so that they would be safe. And he blocked the door, and Sung-Wi Cho was shooting bullets through the door, and he kept saying, hurry, 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 until the last breath he took, he told students to hurry, and everyone in his class got out the window, except one other student, Mina Panchal, who stayed behind and encouraged others to go ahead of him. And Professor Librescu was one of the 32 killed that day, but here's the amazing thing about Liviu Librescu that I just find myself continuing to contemplate. Liviu Librescu was 76 years old. He was born in the 1930s as a Jew in Romania. And when Hitler and the Nazis started to sweep across Europe, he and his family were put into labor camps and concentration camps. But this amazing survivor, who was a young boy and a teenager, survived the Holocaust. Most of his family was killed. He survived the Holocaust. And now he's a teenager with a lot of his family gone. And a lot of people who had been through that experience in Romania decided to leave. They were so shattered. But this is my home. My family's gone. This is my home. I'm going to stay in Romania. Then the Soviet Union took over Romania. And they asked that he renounces Judaism. And he wouldn't do it. And then they asked that he pledge allegiance to the Communist Party, and he wouldn't do it. And so he had gotten a PhD. He was a well-recognized engineer, but suddenly, first, you can't travel to go to academic conferences, and then second, you're going to lose your job. And this Holocaust survivor now has to live under Soviet communism and be persecuted, but he wouldn't give up his faith, and he wouldn't give up his moral integrity. And he kept trying for a better life. And finally, in 1977, when he was past 40, he was allowed to emigrate to Israel. And he moved to Israel. And that had been his dream. And he was a teacher in Israel. In 1985, he got a one-year teaching fellowship at Virginia Tech in Blacksburg to come teach engineering. And he came in 1985 for a one-year fellowship, and he kept renewing it year after year after year because he found in Virginia, he found in America, he found in Blacksburg a community that he loved and a community that he cared about. So somebody who survived the Holocaust of the Nazis, who survived the Soviet oppression of his native land, couldn't survive the Holocaust of gun violence in this country. And there's one more thing about Liviu Librescu, and it's about the day that he was killed, because it was a very different day for him than it was for his students. It was a Monday. It was April 16, 2007, but that day was a special day in the Jewish faith for somebody who was Jewish. It's Yom HaShoah, from sundown on the 15th of April 2007 till sundown on April 16. It's the day to remember the Holocaust. And Jews worldwide and people who care about Judaism worldwide, it's a day to remember the Holocaust. And when you remember the Holocaust, well, it's one thing to reflect upon it, but it's another thing to reflect upon it as a Holocaust survivor. And what you reflect upon is the perpetrators and the gravity of the tragedy that they perpetrated. And you reflect upon the victims who lost their lives, and you reflect upon the survivors. And you reflect upon the heroes. And you also reflect upon the bystanders. You also reflect upon the bystanders. And so while the students who went into that class on the morning of April 16th, they weren't thinking about Yom HaShoah, Liviu Librescu was. And I've got to believe when that shooting started on this day where he's thinking about what he's been through, then he's faced with an existential, am I going to be a perpetrator? Am I going to be a victim? Am I going to be a survivor? Am I going to be a bystander? I'm going to be a hero. And he chose to be a hero. And he lost his life. He chose to be a hero. And he lost his life. Would I do that? Would I stand in front of a door and block it and take bullets and tell my students to get out the window? Would I do that? I cannot honestly stand here and say that I would. I can't say that I would have the courage of Liviu Librescu. He was a hero. I can't say I'd be a hero. But in this body, we don't have to be heroes. We just have to not be bystanders. We've been bystanders in this body. We've been bystanders in this nation as this carnage of gun violence has gone from one tragedy to the next. To cast a vote, that's not heroic. To stand up and say, we can be safer tomorrow, we can protect people's lives, that's not heroic. That's just saying, I will not be a bystander. And that's all we have to do. Stop being bystanders. And Mr. President, I would just ask my colleague from Connecticut if he has any close on that, and I appreciate the chance to engage in this dialogue with him.